So here's a couple of quick reactions that I have to the news that Bob Iger is back at Disney. He had a town hall meeting recently, and one of his key messages was the fact that the company needs to return to their core business, i.e. creativity. So what had happened? Bob Iger had been there. He had ridden a company, done some tremendous deals with acquisitions and partnerships and all sorts of else, expanding the network and the infrastructure of the Disney franchise. He handed over the reins to an operator, somebody who had come out of the Disney parks business, somebody who was well known for running the parks business really well. But over a period of time, and it didn't take that long, there was some resentment. People felt that as an operator, Bob Chapek, who had come in to run the business, really wasn't doing the business much justice. And you'll think back to the very unfavorable public spat that Disney got into with Scarlett Johansson, arguing over pay when the movie that she was in had been released both streaming and in movies, cinemas at the same time, yet her compensation was linked to cinema ticket sales. So all of this was just very un-Disney. It just weren't the values of Disney. So that started off it had happened early on in his tenure. A lot of these things started to happen, and it started to show what happens when you get somebody in the role who is obviously really equipped for the role, but shares a different value system in terms of what is important at Disney and what they valued. And always what has been important at Disney has been the creative process and the creative genius and the imagination. Where dreams are made is all about what Disney is. And we think back to a couple of other analogies where this has happened, and there's some not so prominent stories, but there's also some very prominent stories. The most prominent is probably Apple. When Steve Jobs left, John Scully came in and took over, and John Scully was an operator. He came from PepsiCo. Ultimately, what happened is Scully was out, and when Jobs came back in, he said, we've got to get back to what made us great. And that is an appreciation for and an understanding for what consumers really, really love. They indexed heavily on design. That did not mean that they couldn't also be a supply chain powerhouse. They learned how to create products that were incredibly complex, but with a very short lead time. So they didn't tie up a lot of their working capital in supply chains and warehouses. So you can be very good at operations and still retain your essence, which in Apple's case was about design. Starbucks had a similar situation. Howard Schultz was the CEO. He left, and an operator came in. And the operator came in, and he was really good at running the operations. But ultimately, what started to happen is the value set was different. And you saw employee groups starting to move to mobilize for unionization. Too many mobilize and unionize in the same sentence there. But the idea here that ultimately what started to happen is the value system was a little bit different. We were pushing for heavy optimization around the operations part of the business, but really what made Starbucks was the culture, and at one point them wanting to be the third place between your home and your work and the place that you wanted to go, except it didn't feel like that to employees and increasingly to consumers. So what happened is Howard Schultz came back, just like Steve Jobs came back, and just like Bob Iger has now come back. There's a very important message here around, and a lesson when you look at succession, around what is important. Ultimately, what is really, really important is the fact that we need to get people into those roles who share the core DNA of what makes that company as great as it is and as great as it can be. And then layer on top of that, perhaps, the idea that we're going to have, operational excellence, perhaps. But that is a close second, but it's not first. A close second to whatever else makes the business good. So, really, really interesting news coming out, seeing that Bob Iger is going to take Disney back to its core of creativity, valuing and empowering the creative groups at Disney. I think it's going to be an interesting story to watch. They've got some pretty big headwinds with the amount of money they're spending on streaming to build content against Apple, against Netflix, against Hulu. Well, Hulu's kind of part Disney. So ultimately, though, in the content wars, Amazon, there's a ton of pressure that they're needing to scale against, as well as, of course, the pressure that they have just in terms of the macroeconomic environment with inflation and what they're seeing in the world right now. So an interesting time indeed. Succession is a really important story here. Making sure you get the right person with the right values is what it's all about. So looking forward to seeing the next chapter in this story.